welcome back to another episode of How Did We Not Know That? My name's Jack.
And I'm Nat.
And today, Nat will be talking about, I want to say China, but I was like, USA, China, we're in world history, so can I say China?
Yeah, we're talking about China and how the U.S. reestablished diplomatic relationships with China. I don't know. Nixon went to China in the 70s. That's what we're talking about today. Season 2 is world history. We will be talking about America today, but what else is new? I don't know. It's hard for me, when I do research, when I'm learning about history, it's hard for me not to think about stuff, think about historical events and how it relates to American history, so that's just, I guess, my own bias. But yeah, Nixon visited China.
Yeah. Well, we are studying, in your defense, we're studying for the Foreign Service test, and we need to know American history, so it's hard not to think about how experiences abroad will affect us.
That's very true. But yeah, and this event affected the whole world, so it's exciting. Okay, so before I continue with the episode, really quickly, we wanted to remind our listeners that if they want to support us and help us improve the quality of our show, they can contribute to our Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/howdidwe.know-that, you can find our profile. You can become a history hero for the low price of $3 a month. You'll get access to exclusive polls where you can help us choose the topics of our episodes and more exciting things. Or if you prefer, you can make a one-time donation. We're not picky. It's the holiday season, so I don't know, give us money.
We just had Giving Tuesday, help us out, okay? We're doing this for free.
Yeah, give us your money. Yeah, we also have a website, www.HDWNKT.com, and on our website you can find our show notes, you can find our episodes. We also have amazing study guides, so if you, like us, are studying for the Foreign Service Officer test, or you are studying history, or you just like study guides, we have little notes for each episode that you can use, so please check it out. We worked hard on those. And yeah, share the show with your friends. Help us, help people find our show. Give us good reviews. I don't know.
Give us a rating. Yeah, unless you want to give us a 1-star rating, in which case don't worry about it.
Don't waste your time. It's okay. 5 stars only. 5 stars
right.
only.
Yeah, if you want to give us anything under a 5-star, just
yeah, it's okay. We're fine. So yeah, let's get on to the episode. So yeah, I'm talking about 1972. Nixon visits China. U.S. President Richard Nixon. That might seem okay, whatever. Presidents travel places all the time. But this event, this trip, changed the world forever. So let me set the stage. Give you a little background on China and America. So from 1912 to 1949, China was involved with a civil war. There were a bunch of different political groups and little governments that were all claiming power over mainland China, and they were oh, we're the representative of China. One of these groups was the Republic of China, which was led by Chiang Kai-shek. They're one of the more dominant forces during the Civil War, and they're pretty much one of the strongest. They're the strongest government during this time period. But then 1949, the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, they successfully revolt. They overthrow the Republic of China in a communist revolution. They take over mainland China and they call it the People's Republic of China. So you have two Chinas. There's People's Republic of China, led by Mao Zedong, and the Republic of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek. After Chiang Kai-shek is overthrown, him and his government retreat to Taiwan. So Chiang Kai-shek is in Taiwan, Mao Zedong is in mainland China. Both governments claim that they're like the sole legitimate power representative of China, and neither governments formally recognize each other. And before the 1970s, the Republic of China, the one in Taiwan, was recognized by most countries as well as the United Nations as the only legitimate government of China. So they were like, okay, the Taiwan, like that Republic of China, Chiang Kai-shek, that's China. The communist China, they're not China. And actually, the Republic of China was one of the founding members of the United Nations, and they were one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council until 1971. In 1971, the UN voted to expel the Republic of China, and they were instead replaced by the Communist People's Republic of China. So the PRC, they were like, okay, actually, they're the real China. So they like switched the rhetoric. At the time that like the PRC replaces our Republic of China in the UN, at this time, the People's Republic of China, mainland China, they're like completely isolated from the outside world because of the chaos from the Cultural Revolution, which we're not going to get into today. But basically, they didn't have pretty much any like communication with the outside world, and they didn't have a lot of trade agreements with other countries, so they were pretty isolated. Yeah. So the U.S., you might be wondering, probably if you're an American, you might be wondering, wait, like, what's the history of U.S.-China relations? I'm not going to go, like, too far back into history, but basically, like, the U.S. has always been wary of China. Like, they didn't want it to become too close to, like, Russia, or even like other European countries like France or Germany and Britain. They were like, they can be a really powerful asset to us, but like we don't want them. Yeah, we don't want other countries controlling them. Like we kind of want to control them. Actually, in 1899, the U.S. established the open door policy, which basically ensured that all nations had equal trading privileges with China. And so basically, like, the U.S. was able to enforce this policy because it had so much power in the Pacific, because it had just won the Spanish-American War in 1898, which we will cover later. I feel like every 3 episodes I say this.
Every episode, false
One day
promises.
we will be getting a Spanish-American War episode. And then at this time in, like, the 1940s, the U.S. and China are basically enemies. The People's Republic of China were fighting U.S. troops in the Korean War in the early 1950s. The U.S. was fighting alongside South Korea, while People's Republic of China was fighting alongside North Korea. So they were like enemies there. They were also enemies in Vietnam because China was sending aid and support, like weapons, other like food, supplies to North Vietnam, and the U.S. was like obviously helping like southern Vietnam, and so they were like, ooh, China. So flash forward 1970s, U.S. President Richard Nixon is in the middle of the wildly unpopular Vietnam War. People do not like the war. They don't support the war. We're not winning the war, and so people think we're losing the fight to communism. So Richard Nixon is like, okay, we gotta do something to like make the U.S. look good, make us look like we can successfully fend off or successfully deal with the threat of communism. And it's kind of crazy that Nixon is the one to have like diplomatically resolved relations with communist China, because he had always been like so like anti-communist his whole political career in like the 1940s and 1950s. He was like attacking Harry Truman's policy in the Democratic Party, like their policy towards China, because he was like, oh, you guys are the reason why communist China won the Chinese Civil War. He's like, oh, you guys let the communists take over the world. But then things started changing. He needed something good to happen during the Vietnam War. And then China was also kind of desperate at this time. So in the 1960s, the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union started having like a lot of conflicts. And at first it was just like quote unquote a war of words. But then there would be occasional border conflicts between China and the Soviet Union. And they were like, oh my gosh, there's these two huge like countries. Are they gonna fight each other? Are they going to go to war? And so the People's Republic of China was like, yo, we desperately need an ally, because if we go to war, we're going to be screwed. Like, the Soviet Union is huge. And so they're like, okay, we'd be open to maybe talking to the U.S. And also they would want to talk about U.S.-China trade policy, because at the time, like, they weren't engaging in trade. They were like had their doors closed, and yeah. And yeah. And then they're like, hey, we're gonna need supplies for this war, so let's talk about trade. And so basically, Nixon's trip to China was a very calculated move that was intended to like drive a wedge in between China and Soviet Union. These two countries are the world's like most significant communist powers. So he was like, okay, if I could like separate the two, if they're enemies, that's great. We don't want them to be friends. We want them to be enemies. And so they could like leverage their partnership with China against Soviet Union. Yeah. And then they could also be like, hey, China, now that we're friends, why don't you back out of Vietnam and like let us win the war, you know? Yeah, the U.S. thought that they could convince China to leave Vietnam because the People's Republic of China and North Vietnam were like still really suspicious of each other. It's not like they were like best friends. They were allies in that war, but they were not like friendly towards each other. So historian Walter Lefebvre said, quote, instead of using Vietnam to contain China, Nixon concluded that he had better use China to contain Vietnam, unquote. And again, his whole argument for talking to China, because, okay, a side note, you have to think, like, you have to remember, at this time, like, Nixon's supporters were extremely, extremely anti-communist, and, like, pretty much the general sentiment in America was, like, anti-communist, like, we're fighting wars in Korea and Vietnam, all around the world, like, to be like, hey, no more communism. And for him to all of a sudden announce, like, hey, remember, like, one of our, like, biggest enemies? Yo, I'm gonna go, like, on a trip there and become friends with, like, Mao Zedong. Like, you know? So he had to, like, really convince, like, he had to have a good reason for why he was doing that. And so he was like, you know, we need to become friends with China before it's too late. That was basically his argument. He had decided that the situation at the moment was really bad, and that if they just left China alone, like, they would become, like, so powerful, and, like, they would have, like, all this hatred towards America, and it'd be, like, keep growing and growing, and it'd be harder to, like, deal with later. So he's like, okay, enough is enough. So he basically saw the need to open China to the rest of the world and open the world to China, because he was like, you know, they're all isolated, they're not getting any interaction with, like, other countries. We need to, like, let foreign influence their politics and, like, influence their culture. So
yeah, what's that one quote? It's like, keep your enemies close and your, like, friends closer, or your friends close, enemies closer.
Yeah, keep your friends close, your enemies closer. Yeah, that's
basically... So Nixon's like, we gotta, like, have them very close to us.
Right? Yeah. So that's exactly what he was saying. He was like, oh, they're angry. He called it like their angry isolation. It would be like the downfall of democracy. Here's a quote from Nixon himself. He said, "We simply cannot afford to leave China forever outside the family of nations, there to nurture its fantasies, cherish its hate, and threaten its neighbors," unquote. So yeah, that was his argument. And obviously, this would be like a huge diplomatic feat. You know, these countries, China had not had diplomatic relations with the U.S. since before the Civil War. It had been like decades. And it's like communist China and then anti-communist America. Like, how do you even negotiate? Like, hey, come over to like my house for dinner. Like, I don't know. So first, Mao Zedong spoke to the American journalist Edgar Snow in 1970, and he was like, hey, actually, I'd be willing to improve relations with the U.S. And that was like a huge deal. They were like, oh my God, because Mao Zedong is like the face of communism, like one of the faces.
Yeah, I'm curious, did you find anything as like the motives for China also wanting to meet? Because it's like, as Americans, we're going to credit Nixon a lot with this, but also it's a two-way road to get an agreement. So Mao Zedong also must have had his reasons for wanting to.
Well, yeah, because I mean, a lot of it had to do with like this whole like all the increasing tensions with the Soviet Union, you know? He was like, I need someone on my side. And then he wanted, like, the country was so isolated because he wanted to, like, control everyone. But I think, like, basically he was like, okay, I can't, like, sustain this for so long. I need to, like, trade with other countries. And, like, the U.S. would be a really beneficial trading partner. President Nixon kind of had to take, like, a diplomatic gamble with this whole, like, with the whole negotiation process. He was like he was the one to like make the first move. He had to give a lot of concessions. So that means like he had to give up a lot of power or like a lot of his leverage in order to get the People's Republic of China to like agree to meet with him, you know? And so it was a lot of unilateral initiatives, which that means like it's just the U.S. like working towards like giving up its leverage and like doing things that will make China happy, you know, like China's not really doing much in response. So it's like pretty risky politically to be like, hey, this is one of our biggest enemies, and like I'm just gonna like do a lot of nice things for them. So the first thing that Nixon did was they intervened in the like growing Sino-Soviet dispute. Side note, Sino means China. Sino-Soviet dispute, because like the Soviet Union was sending forces to its border with China. This is in 1969, right? And so like the U.S. intervenes without China even asking. So they're like, oh, let me just help you. So Nixon sent a message to Moscow saying that the U.S. would respond to any Soviet aggression against China. So if like the Soviet Union did anything bad towards China, the U.S. would step in and like support and defend China. And this was a huge deal because it was pretty much an unprecedented security guarantee to a country that at the time had forces fighting like America's enemy in Vietnam. So like we're fighting against China in Vietnam, but then at the same time we're like, hey, we're gonna defend you if the Soviet Union tries to attack you, you know? And the U.S. asked for nothing in return, and China offered nothing. So it was just like, what? Like, that's wild. That's, like, not... It doesn't... I guess it was very different than the rest of the U.S., like, foreign policy, ideology. And so then... like, in order to further show, like, good American faith about his trip to China, President Nixon gave Mao Zedong exactly what most of what he wanted in regards to Taiwan. So the U.S. had, like, a large military presence in Taiwan because they were like, ooh, we think that this is the legitimate government of China, and like we don't want People's Republic of China in mainland China to come and attack Taiwan, you know? Because mainland China had always been saying, oh, there's only one China, like Taiwan is actually part of mainland China. That's like Taiwan is part of China, you know? So one day we're gonna unite, whether it's peaceful or not. And so like the US sent a bunch of military support to Taiwan. But then Nixon like pretty much takes like most of our military out of Taiwan, and like he withdraws all of US forces that had been stationed there. And that was like a really huge deal because Taiwan is like, what the heck? You're like our biggest ally, and you just like are changing.
You're like, please don't.
They're like, what? Yeah, they were very surprised, and they're like, okay, why are you like changing your mind so suddenly? Yeah. So okay, are you, Jack? Are you familiar with like the one China principle?
Yeah, like the concept that like they want to have like one, like everyone who's Chinese or in China, like you're Chinese, like we're all one country.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it.
Like that?
Yeah. It's basically that. I'll just like reiterate it one more time just for our listeners. Because it's like, yeah, it's still like a really hot topic today. So basically, the one China principle, mainland China says that like, argues that like Taiwan, Hong Kong are part of, it's all one China, and that like one day China will be like reunified, and whether it's like peacefully, non-peacefully, it depends. But yeah, they claim Taiwan is like part of mainland China. Not all of those places agree with the one China. I know many people in Taiwan don't agree with it. Many people in Hong Kong. But the U.S., for the most part, has supported the one China policy. They've kind of like, they haven't like strongly supported it publicly, but they've been like the U.S., like the general trend has been like, okay, like we're just going to follow one China policy, so we don't really recognize Taiwan as like the legitimate. Yeah. So it's kind of, we're not like fighting in support of the one China policy, but we're not really doing anything.
Gonna go against
it.
Like let it be. Like you guys kind of sort that out.
Yeah, like they're like, okay, we would support like a peaceful merger if both parties agree, but like, a forced merger, I don't think the U.S. is very supportive, or at least in the past, but yeah. Yeah, so during this time period, that's really when the one China policy emerges and when the U.S. starts taking that attitude. And then, later in 1971, China invites the U.S. table tennis, the ping pong team for a visit, which is like a really big deal because Americans haven't been allowed in China for a really long time, and they're like, hey, come on over, friendly competition. It's like showing, warming relationships. And then a few months later, Henry Kissinger, who was Nixon's security advisor, he would later be Secretary of State, he made a secret visit to Beijing, which was facilitated by Pakistan, and he secretly went to Beijing. And then when he visited, China was like, okay, we can invite President Nixon over publicly. So finally, Nixon visits China in February 1972. He goes to communist China with his wife, Pat, for a week. And he's the first U.S. president to visit the People's Republic of China since it was established in 1949. And it was, it was just a really huge deal. I guess, the way I can, comprehend it a little more easily, when President Donald Trump met with leader Kim Jong-un of North Korea, the summit, that was a really big deal, seeing the two leaders of countries that are such big enemies meeting for the first time. Yeah, it's basically on that same level, It's a huge deal.
Wait, before you go on, did you say that, was there an ambassador that went to Beijing secretly?
Yeah, Henry Kissinger. He was his national security advisor, but then he later became Secretary of State. So President Nixon meets with Chairman, what do you call him? Chairman Mao? The leader?
Yeah, Chairman Mao.
Yeah, Chairman Mao Zedong. And it's, like, the photo op is iconic. Like, they visit the Great Wall, the Forbidden City. They have a bunch of banquets together. And the two leaders agree to expand cultural contact between the two countries. And President Nixon also established plans for a permanent U.S. trade mission in China, which is a really big deal because now today, like, China's like one of our biggest trading partners. It's a little different recently, trade wars and everything, but like, imagine a world where the U.S. and China didn't engage in trade together.
I mean, we'd probably be like more self-sufficient, or just like more Southeast Asian countries would have been developed, I feel. Or we would have partnered with India sooner, I think.
Yeah, we would have found someone to like manufacture goods
to exploit,
like, you know, cheap labor. Yeah, we would have found cheap labor somewhere. But like, imagine like there would be no like made in China like sticker. Be very different. And yeah,
it's weird. I wonder if like, so probably before the 70s there was no made in China. There couldn't be. There's no trade.
Yeah. There wasn't a lot of trade, at least not with democratic countries. So yeah. Okay, and then just like another little light side note, they also exchanged zoo animals. So China gave the U.S. 2 giant pandas. Their names were Ling Ling and Sing Sing. And then the U.S. gave China 2 musk oxen. I had to Google that. It's like these giant furry oxes. I don't even know what their names was. Like, they're cute, but I don't know. You can't compete against pandas. Like,
that's true,
right? But so that was just
that's cute.
Yeah.
It's that it literally, like, as you're telling me this, I'm like, oh my gosh, Nixon and Mao had a really fun time together. It's just like a day like touring China with your friend.
Literally reminds me of our time touring.
Yeah.
Touring China.
Except my friends never gave me a China. They never gave me a panda. So
yeah, we didn't come back with 2 pandas, unfortunately.
I don't have oxen to give, so that's fair.
Oh, shoot, I forgot my musk oxen. I don't even, like, they're so big, too. How do you even, whatever, I'm not going to get into it, but,
they just transport animals. That, like, which, like, should you be transporting animals? Do we agree with zoos? Like,
That's a whole nother, like,
right.
Oh my
God. That's a mini-sode.
Yeah, right? Mini-sode. Do we agree with zoos? Yeah, so, like, just before I wrap up, I just want to, like, quickly talk about just the aftermath of this incredibly historic event in history. So, after Nixon's visit to China in 1972, the U.S. enters a period of détente, which is, like, a French word. Basically, it means that, like, the Americans want a lower profile in world affairs, especially after the Vietnam War. They're like, okay, maybe we shouldn't try to be like the world police. Like, maybe we can't handle that. So, like, let's just try to chill. So they're trying to, like, come to diplomatic resolutions with China, you know, solve their conflicts diplomatically. And then in May of 1972, a few months after he gets back from China, Nixon travels to the Soviet Union and he signs the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, also known as SALT I, which we should probably talk about at some point because it's really important. Yeah, and this basically, like, the U.S. and the Soviet Union start signing agreements about, like, reducing arms and, like, implementing arms control and disarmament. They're like, hey, let's not have a nuclear war. So that's a really big deal, too. And then in 1975, the Vietnam War ends. Finally, the U.S. loses and is humiliated. China never left Vietnam, even though the U.S. had hoped they would after all they did, all the nice things they did. That didn't happen.
All the ox we gave them, like, it wasn't enough.
Our musk oxen meant nothing to you. Are you kidding? No, China was like, really? Okay, thanks for the ox. They continued to give North Vietnam, like, materials and weapons and even some fighters. And then they helped defeat the U.S. So I was like, oh, awkward. So people were like, oh, okay, improvement, like relationships were improving between Soviet Union and China. So maybe the Cold War will like come to an end. But it didn't really resolve everything immediately. The economy was like really unstable during this period. And I'm not going to get into this tangent because I'm so passionate about this topic. Maybe we'll do a mini-sode about it. During this time period, the economy is so unstable. So President Nixon, like, modifies the entire international financial system. He removes, like, the gold standard, and he replaces, like, currency used to be tied to gold, and then he was like, no, now it's tied to the US dollar. So you can look it up on your own. We were talking about it, right?
This. Wow, we need to cover that. That's really important.
It's so wild. I can't believe people don't talk about it, but it's a really crazy topic. So stay tuned for that. And then, so Nixon later, like in his old age, he would like reflect on his policy towards China, and he was just like, like, we shouldn't close China off from the world, but he's like, these two countries have, quote unquote, irreconcilable differences. So he's like, I don't think we can ever be friends, but we shouldn't.
Really?
Yeah, he's like, we're just so different. I don't think there will ever be like a completely peaceful relationship. But
between China and the USA. That's so sad.
Yeah, but he was like, we should not close our doors to China. I have one more quote from President Nixon. He said, to leave the present and future leaders of China isolated, nurturing their resentments and even hatred of the United States because of what they consider to be unjustified actions against China is senseless and counterproductive, unquote. So it's really similar to what he said in 1972. He, like, stuck by that as he grew older and, like, saw China developing and evolving. And so China today, still, like, the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China, they still don't officially recognize each other's sovereignty. Although now, today, the argument is more about, like, Taiwan's political status rather than their claim over China. It's more like, okay, are we a sovereign nation? I feel like China's like, okay, whatever. Like, maybe they're not focusing as much about who's a legitimate representative of China. They kind of just want to be their own sovereign nation.
I'm pretty sure Taiwanese people and just Taiwan in general is just like, let us be Taiwan. And then for China, it's like, no, you're part of, like, China. You're not just, like, by yourself.
Right? Yeah. Yeah, so that's, like, something to, like, keep an eye out, like, current events, how we can relate this 1972 visit and One China policy. One China policy today, we should be talking about the One China policy more, especially, I don't know if people are keeping up with current events in Hong Kong, but that's a really big issue, Hong Kong sovereignty, so everyone should look into that. And No,
I just want to add, too, like, it's interesting. I don't know if any of our listeners are friends with, like, people who live in mainland China and Taiwan or Hong Kong and Hong Kong. But if you talk to your friends in those countries, or if you're from there, it's so interesting the difference between the mindset, because I'll talk to my Hong Kongese friends and, they'll explain to me what's happening in Hong Kong, and you hear their side and you're like, okay, that makes sense. I understand. Then you talk to, like, I'll talk to a Chinese friend and it's completely, like, opposite, but they also, like, have very valid ideas as to why. And I'll ask them, like, especially when I was literally in China when the Hong Kong protests were going on, and I was talking to my friends in China about it, and I was like, so what do you think, though, about, like, Hong Kongese people? Because the claim is that they're not part of mainland China. They don't want to be persecuted the same way as people in mainland China. And they were like, well, of course they're Chinese. No question in their mind are Hong Kongese people any different, even if they, like, were under British rule, even if they are, like, democratic. Are they democratic?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, they used to be.
Even if they, like, speak Cantonese instead of Mandarin, they choose, like, no question they're Chinese. Like, it's just, like, why would you even say that they're anything different? And same with Taiwan, same with Tibet. Like, anywhere where China is, like, one country is, like...
Yeah, it's, like, it's a really complicated situation. And, like, yeah, you're so right, where, like, each side has their own really, like, strong opinions, their own valid, what they consider to be, like, valid arguments, you know. And it's like, yeah, I think, like, what we can do, like, as someone who's not from China, not from Hong Kong, like, I think it's just good to listen to both sides, like, directly, instead of, like, I don't know, thinking about, like, for me as an American, I'm like, oh, what is America's, like, stance on the issue? I think it's also important to be like, okay, let's hear from, like, people directly. You know what I'm trying to say?
I think that you really do. People have very strong opinions on both sides, but each person has their reasons for those strong opinions. So you really don't know unless you are there, or if you talk to them, you don't know what that atmosphere is like. But I think, I agree with what you're saying. Like, it's hard for us to make a claim just, like, reading our westernized articles and, like, being taught a certain way to think in America, because that happens to us too, that it's hard to make judgments on what's happening. In order to be a good diplomat, you have to be able to, like, understand different sides of where people are coming from, because how are you going to make peace if you don't even listen to another side?
That's so true. Like, in order to, like, come up with, like, actual successful, like, resolutions to conflicts and, like, develop meaningful relationships, you need to, like, be able to actually understand another person's perspective. Like, so cheesy, but, like, put yourselves in their shoes and, like, understand their thought process and, like, their history, their background, their culture. Like, that's how you come to an agreement. That's how you come to an understanding. So, yeah, I think, like, direct sources, like, right now, like, it's hard to travel, and it's harder to get that, like, interaction, like, immersing yourself in another country, talking to people from the country. But, like, if you're studying and you're, like, trying to learn about history, trying to broaden your horizons, like, direct sources are your friend.
Well, thank you so much, Nat, for covering this topic. It was very interesting. I didn't realize that that Nixon did all that with Mao Zedong, and how that kind of led to our fluctuation in trade with China. So that's really fascinating to hear about.
Yeah. Well, thank you for listening, and I'm excited to hear your episode next week. Ooh. All right. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Bye.
Bye. This has been an episode of How Did We Not Know That?
If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from.
You can also follow us on all social media, including YouTube, at How Did We Not Know That?
If you thought our podcast was low quality, we know. We thought so too. Help us improve the podcast by contributing to our Patreon.
Thank you for listening, and see you guys next week.